For almost 45 years, a Soviet biological weapons testing center existed on a godforsaken island in the middle of the Aral Sea. A residential town with a school, stores, a post office, a canteen, scientific laboratories, and, of course, a testing range, where large-scale tests of deadly biological agents, including anthrax, plague, tularemia, brucellosis, and typhoid, were carried out. In the early 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the military abandoned both the city and the testing ground in the Aral Sea sands. Back in the late 1920s, the command of the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army was concerned about choosing a place to locate a scientific center for the development of biological weapons and a testing ground for them. The task of spreading the proletarian revolution throughout the world was still on the agenda, and projectiles with deadly strains inside could accelerate the construction of a workers' and peasants' state on a planetary scale. For this noble purpose, it was necessary to choose a relatively large island at least 5 to 10 kilometers off the coast. A suitable candidate was sought even on Lake Baikal, but in the end we decided to stop at 3 sites, the Solovetsky Islands in the White Sea and the solitary islands of Gorodomlya on Lake Seliger and Vozrozdenia in the Aral Sea. The main pre-war center for the study of this important problem was the island of Gorodomlya, located in the Tver region, which was in relative proximity to the capital of the USSR. In 1936 to 1941, the third test laboratory, the main Soviet center for the development of biological weapons, was located here, transferred from Suzdal monasteries and subordinate to the military chemical administration of the Red Army. However, the Great Patriotic War showed convincingly that such institutions should henceforth be established much farther from the borders of the USSR with its probable adversaries. Vozrozdenia Island suited this task perfectly. This deserted piece of land in the Aral Sea, a drainless salt lake on the border of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, was discovered in 1848. The lifeless archipelago, which lacked fresh water, for some unimaginable reason was called the Tsarist Islands, and its constituent parts, the islands of Nicholas, Constantine, and Air. It was Nikolai, optimistically, or perhaps ironically, renamed Renaissance Island, which after the war became a top-secret Soviet-based testing ground for lethal diseases put in the service of the motherland. This island of about 200 square kilometers met all safety requirements at first sight: practically uninhabited surroundings, flat terrain, and a hot climate unsuitable for pathogenic organisms to survive. In the northern part of the island was built military town Kantebek, officially called ARALSK 7. In general, it was similar to hundreds of its counterparts that emerged in the Soviet Union: 12.5 houses for officers and scientific personnel, a club, a canteen, a stadium, stores, barracks, and parade ground, its own power plant. So ARALSK 7 looked like this on the picture of American spy satellite of the late 1960s. Near the village was built a unique airfield, Barkhan, the only one in the Soviet Union with 4 runways, reminiscent of the location of the Wind Rose. There is always a strong wind blowing on the island, sometimes changing its direction. Depending on the weather, the planes landed on one or the other runway. All in all, there were up to 1,500 military personnel and their families here. It was, in fact, the usual garrison life, the peculiarities of which were only the special secrecy of the facility and not too comfortable climate. Children went to school, their parents went to work, watched movies in the officer's house in the evenings, and on weekends had picnics on the shore of the Aral Sea, which until the mid-1980s really looked like a sea. Kantebek in its heyday. There was a sea connection to the nearest city on the big land, ARALSK. Barges brought here in fresh water, which was then stored in special huge tanks on the outskirts of the village. A laboratory complex, PNAL 52 52nd Field Research Laboratory, was built several kilometers away from the settlement, where, among other things, the guinea pigs were kept and who became the main victims of tests conducted there. The scale of the research is illustrated by the following fact. In the 1980s, the USSR Foreign Trade Agency purchased a batch of 500 monkeys from Africa specifically for this purpose. All of them eventually became victims of a strain of tularemia microbe, after which their corpses were burned and the ashes were buried on the island. The test site itself occupied the southern part of the island. It was here that shells were detonated or pathogenic strains based on anthrax, plague, tularemia, Q fever, brucellosis, glanders, other especially dangerous infections, as well as a large number of artificially created biological agents were sprayed from aircraft. The location of the test site to the south was determined by the prevailing winds on the island. The aerosol cloud resulting from the test, in effect a weapon of mass destruction, was carried by the wind in the opposite direction from the military camp, after which anti-epidemic measures and decontamination of the area were obligatory. The hot climate with regular 40-degree heat was an additional factor that ensured the safety of military biologists. Most bacteria and viruses were killed by prolonged exposure to high temperatures. All specialists participating in the tests underwent obligatory quarantine. Simultaneously with the post-war intensification of military scientific work on Vozrozhdenia Island, the Soviet leadership at first unnoticed the beginning of an environmental disaster, which eventually led to the colossal degradation of the Aral Sea. The Amu Darya and Sir Darya were the main sources of feeding the Lake Sea. In total, these two largest rivers of Central Asia supplied about 60 cubic kilometers of water per year to the Aral Sea. In the 1960s, the waters of these rivers began to be dismantled by reclamation canals. It was decided to turn the surrounding deserts into a garden and grow there such needed by the national economy cotton. The result was not long in coming. The cotton crop, of course, increased, but the Aral Sea began to rapidly shallow. In the early 1970s, the amount of river water reaching the sea decreased by a third. After another decade, the Aral Sea began to receive only 15 cubic kilometers per year, and in the mid-1980s, this figure dropped to 1 cubic kilometer. By 2001 the sea level had dropped 20 meters, the volume of water had decreased 3 times, and the water surface area had decreased 2 times. The Aral split into 2 unconnected large lakes and many small lakes. Further, the shoaling process continued. The area of Renaissance Island with the shallowing of the sea began to grow just as rapidly, and in the 1990s rose to almost 10 times. The Royal Islands first merged into one island, and in the 2000s it joined the Big Land and became, in fact, a peninsula. The final burying of the test site on Vozrozhdenia Island was the collapse of the USSR. Weapons of mass destruction turned into an irrelevant entity in post-Soviet realities, and in November 1991 the military biological laboratory ARALSK 7 was closed. The population of the settlement was evacuated within a few weeks. All infrastructure, residential and laboratory, and equipment were abandoned, and Kantebek turned into a ghost town. The military were quickly replaced by looters, who appreciated in their own way the riches of the former top-secret science center left behind by the army and scientists. Everything of any value that could be dismantled and transported was removed from the island. Kantebek ARALSK 7 became an elusive dream for lovers of abandoned cities. The streets of the town of Soviet military biologists, where 2 and a few decades ago the garrison life flowed measuredly. The apartment buildings. Children will never go to this school. Tank for fresh water, delivered from the mainland. In contrast to the Chernobyl exclusion zone, you can be here without risk to your health. Biological hazards are much less persistent than radiation, although environmentalists are still beating the alarm because of the continued existence of burial grounds with the remains of animals who died during testing in the former landfill. At times, however, the scenery is still reminiscent of the outskirts of so distant Ukrainian Pripyat. Renaissance Island with its mysterious top-secret history and apocalyptic present couldn't help but interest computer game developers, getting into one of the episodes of Call of Duty, Black Ops. The shallowing Aral Sea opens up a wide space for exploration activities. Already in the 1990s, deposits of oil, gas and rare non-ferrous metals were discovered here. Their active development on the one hand and the transformation of Vozrozhdenia Island into a peninsula on the other make it more and more likely that more and more people will come into contact with the territory of a military biological laboratory. Although military and civilian authorities claim that all necessary security measures for the former test site have been taken in time, one can only guess what else might be hiding in its depths on Ascension Island and how unpleasant these surprises might be for humanity. Subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends. Give it a thumbs up. Tell us interesting facts you know about the topic of this video. See you in new videos.